Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 187. And this episode, we found something very cool that we wanted to share with you. I was walking through the woods. There was no one around and my phone was dead. And then out of the corner of my eye, I found this unlabeled cartridge for the N64. It seemed really cool, and we're just going to blindly play it, and everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. Because today we're talking about meta in games, particularly horror games, and the idea of the haunted and abandoned project and what is left behind.
Yeah, this is something that I think has become more popular in the last few years, but has existed for quite some time. Famous cases of games based on this trope would be Inscription or Shipwreck 64 or Catastrophe Crow.
I mean, yeah, most of Daniel Mullen's work, like The Hex,
Basically.
Pony Island, Inscription, they're fantastic for that.
So these are based on, colloquially on the internet, creepypasta stories, fake stories about real games that were haunted. Stuff like Sonic EXE, Ben Drowned, are some of the more famous ones.
I was always a big fan of Godzilla NES, if only because I actually played that game.
Yeah.
It's a long one, but it's a fun one.
Yeah. Red from Godzilla NES.
Yeah.
As someone who's a recent horror fan, and we've talked about this before, like I'm still finding my way through it, but I have found that the horror games I've enjoyed the most are the ones that kind of make me go, what? You know, kind of do a double take. Another game that was really popular last year that did similar things. It wasn't a haunted game per se, but had some strange visuals, was mouthwashing. Images would blur, glitch out, clearly depicting hallucinations. And because it had the PlayStation style graphics, it kind of leaned into that. There's Petscop, which is a famous found footage PlayStation game that you can't actually play, but there's a YouTube series for.
Yeah, there's more than a few YouTube series that are kind of a game that doesn't exist. You've got, Diminish, Rapid Eyes.
Yeah, and the idea is like someone with some either game dev talent or just some design talent creates a video of a YouTuber playing a found game that was never finished or haunted for some reason, or the developers died or something. And it adds to the narrative of not just the game, which often tends to be unfinished or creepy looking, but then the narrative around it. Again, if you've played Inscription, while I don't want to give up the goat on that game because I think it's really a fun experience, the base premise of Inscription is the same thing, found card game, and what it means for this TCG YouTuber who found it and how it unfolds when you're playing the video game that was found. And I love this idea. I don't know. I don't mind straight up horror stories like Resident Evil. I really enjoyed what I've played of the Resident Evil 2 remake, though I haven't finished it yet, or stuff like Alan Wake. But I think curveballs or meta narratives often just interest me because I think it's a way of doing creative storytelling that I think is really unique and interesting that can not just be found in video games, but the video game version of it is what we're here to talk about today.
Oh, yeah. Well, the thing is, this is an old horror concept that predates video games. This predates Ringu, this predates the haunted, any sort of digital media. This is basically, to my understanding, it's a haunted house. Some of my favorite video game experiences are ones that allow you to explore and set where the narrative goes, or at least kind of set the pace. You are the director and actor within the film that you are playing, kind of thing. And a haunted house is something that, yes, a horror movie, you are following a narrative, but, when you were a teenager in college and going into abandoned houses in the middle of the night with friends with flashlights, whether you actually had that experience or something like it or only heard about it, you're not following a narrative. You're just exploring and going, what the hell is in here? What could we find? Are we going to get attacked? Are there ghosts? Are there real people? Oh my God. And that thrill, which is a thrill that we chase with horror media in all of its forms. And so to have something that is so compact as a video game that also can contain multitudes, you can see how large the abandoned hospital is if you break into it. We do not condone trespassing on Fun and Games Podcast. What you do is your business, but I'm not a cop. If you want a House of Leaves situation, yeah, sure. You go in and suddenly it's bigger on the inside. But Ben Drowned, the N64 cartridge. An N64 cartridge, if it's haunted or not, is the same size as any other one. And you don't know how big it is. You don't know how deep it goes. This also plays with a fun trope as an audience member where when you watch a horror movie and you see somebody go into where the killer is and you're like, why would you do that? Don't go in there. Oh my God. A haunted video game. If you're interested in playing a game, you will play the whole game. Oh, what do I do to get the bad ending? What do I do to get this character mad at me? What do I do to get 100%? If you want a 100% a game and it happens to be possessed by the ghost of a Victorian child, well, you're just going to have to get to know that Victorian child because as gamers, we are going to go all the way through. So these two ideas kind of meld very well. This creates very fertile ground for this kind of meta exploration. There's other aspects as well, but I think at its core, these sorts of games are haunted houses.
Yeah, and I think the difference between this and, say, a movie or a book that's horror tinted or even meta in this way, a lot of that is more passive. Reading and watching are more passive activities.
It's a theme park ride.
Right. They can be more active, especially reading, using your imagination or whatever. When you're holding the controller, I know plenty of people who have been longtime horror fans who love horror movies and still have trouble playing horror games because it doesn't just go when you're on the ride. You have to make it happen. You have to press go, basically.
Yeah.
When you do that in a video game, I think it really does enhance the experience in a way that has made me find a love for horror video games that I didn't think I'd have differently from horror movies, which I've gotten braver with as well. But I think I lean more towards games because I dictate the experience. And if a jump scare just happened and my heart is racing, I can put the controller down and nothing else happens. In theory, unless you're playing like Five Nights at Freddy's. And which to say, like games like Five Nights at Freddy's and Slender Man, also games that aren't necessarily creepypastas, but definitely build on the vibe of it, right? You think about the narrative within Five Nights at Freddy's, and for those who aren't familiar, it's about murdered children being stuffed into animatronics, pretty like dire stuff, played kind of comedically in moments, not the death, but like how it's framed with the scary animatronics, how the story and throwbacks are told through like pixel animation and all this other stuff. It's a violent act that's not depicted violently, right? It's not graphic, rather.
Right.
But like all of that narrative, especially in the first game, which is basically a handful of PNGs warped and then like a couple of character models, it gives that kind of unknown vibe in the same way that the first Slender Man game was sort of PS1, PS2-esque kind of graphics, like not super detailed, and you're basically wandering through a forest picking up the notes and trying to find them all before you get killed by the Slender Man. I think that those are building on either creepypasta that existed before the game versions of them did, or just leaning into the kinds of things we look for that. I mean, some of the more famous creepypastas don't even have narrative in the game. Like some of the ones I referenced earlier, like Ben Drowned and Sonic EXA, are about finding these games and playing these somehow haunted games. But like one of the more famous video game ones, the Lavender Town music creepypasta, is just based on the music. It has nothing to do with the content of the game. It's just that it was rumored on a creepypasta site that there's a myth that claims that Lavender Town music compelled children to commit suicide or made them sick or gave them lifelong illnesses because of the high frequency of the music. And in the first Pokemon, Red and Blue, and Green, technically, I guess if you were in Japan, that music is very strange comparatively to the rest of the music in the game. It's not unheard of, but it is definitely off feeling, and it's meant to, right? Lavender Town is meant to have a haunted vibe.
It's somber.
Right. And so I love that the story kind of just grew because this music was different. It's kind of why I love now Toby Fox's modern involvement with the Pokemon series, because all of his music has that kind of bent or vibe, and it's kind of a perfect fit to kind of preserve this legacy. The creepypasta doesn't always have to do with the content of the game. It could just be surrounding the game and a myth about it.
Yeah. It's playground rumors.
Yeah.
Mew is under the truck. They had to change the music in Lavender Town because it was causing problems, much the same way that, they can't air the Porygon episode of Pokemon, it'll give you a seizure.
Yeah.
And that's another one where it's just like, oh man, that sounds insane, but it did. And it was Pikachu's fault. We need to make this clear. It was Pikachu made those flashing lights. Porygon just happened to be there and is the sacrificial lamb.
Exactly.
Justice for Porygon. But the fact is, those two things could just as easily be true as they are untrue. The Lavender Town creepypasta definitely goes a little further in that very polybius kind of idea of, do you know what the game did to people? Oh my god, it totally messed them up kind of thing is always a little further. And you look at it and you go, well, that's ridiculous. But everybody checked under the truck from you. And you are just a little curious, aren't you? All you have to do is open the door. And there's just that little bit, and that's what's enticing. And that's what's some of the best horror that I find is empty spaces, is a little bit of nothing that you have to fill in and figure out. If a movie is going to show you the monster, they've got to do a real good job. But if all you see are little bits and pieces or the aftermath of what goes on, your mind fills in the blanks and, oh, that sucks. That's the essence there. And so you get a lot of good examples, the well-known examples of this kind of horror that are simplistic in their art. Pixels or things like that. You know, most of the graphics in I'm Scared is very basic per se, but that's what it's meant to be. And so a lot of, I think, modern meta horror like this, haunted games ideas, you get the PS1, you get the N64. That's not just the current vogue of throwback, though it is. But that is also a time where what's there? What could be there? If the animation's a little stiff or odd, is it intentional? Is it bad design? Is it lulling you in there? You are filling in the blanks. You are finding and making the monster. It's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Polybius, which I think this is one of the earliest meta narratives about a game that I remember. And it's famously a game that doesn't exist, but has been covered by, for me, it was the Angry Video Game Nerd and the Geek Gaming Historian, who both did videos, but specifically the Angry Video Game Nerd, who covered it like it's a game that exists and like slowly goes mad by the end. I love this idea of leaning into, again, a fiction. It's basically creating a stage play, right?
Yeah.
On some level. It's why, like, I've loved a lot of Markiplier's narrative work, because his early narrative work was basically creating a farce with very real characters that then gained momentum and became a whole world that he built with Wharfstash and all these other characters that he's made over the years. Those narratives, I feel, are very born out of the meta-narrative kind of horror storytelling or thriller storytelling. The fact that now we have games being made to emulate that you can actually play. I watched MatPat before he retired play through Shipwreck 64, and like that game intersperses real movie clips that you unlock and uncover within the N64 game that basically looks like a standard N64 game, but as you clip through walls or find hidden pathways, it shows very real video of these creepy or horrific scenes happening with these mascot characters that also had a TV show at the time, or was supposed to, that this game came out. I think it just elevates the horror when you kind of root it in something that feels kind of real, but just unreal enough that your mind goes, really? Did that actually happen?
Yeah. I'm also reminded of, outside of video games, a little less of the real world pieces, but enough of that, like, oh, the intrigue, but oh, the pieces is, there was a series of short stories called The King in Yellow by Robert Chambers that was very much built around the idea of there was a play called The King in Yellow that induces madness in anyone who reads it. I don't know if anyone's tried to write the play The King in Yellow, but I'm sure people have attempted. I don't know if they finished it, and that idea that yeah, you can just take bits and pieces, someone laid the groundwork, and then someone else makes it. Someone else puts it out there. I can imagine that a lot of the creepypastas that we've been talking about that weren't a game before are games now. Whether they do the same thing or not, that's up to you. Some people need to scratch that itch, and for some, it's the horror of the story is enough. But it's gaming. You explore the options you want to.
Yeah, and I mean, The King in Yellow is featured in Signalis, and my favorite thing is that then people posting, has anyone read The King in Yellow? And like discussion about it, like I love that. Or, and I think I brought this up on the show before, myhouse.wad, which is another creepypasta.
Yes.
That's you can actually play and is basically a digital version of The House of Leaves, a book that I still haven't read, but I know a lot about. There was a YouTuber, I now have to remember his name, watching his coverage of myhouse.wad made me a fan of his YouTube work. And so now I want to find his name when I can remember. But like, it was a YouTube video about an actual thing you can play. And he goes into it like he just thinks it's a Doom mod. And like in a House of Leaf style video, starts to unravel as he's playing it. And he starts to unravel as he's playing it. And I love that. I think it's a fun conceit to lean into what the source material is designed for. And instead of just covering it on the face and being like, oh, it's this thing, it's really curious, there's weird stuff in it, instead covering it as if it's affecting you as it affected its original creator. And I love that kind of stuff.
It's the campfire story style. It's the
right.
It happened to someone I know back in the day. You know, one of those kind of stories where it happened to everyone, it happened to no one, but it happened to someone. And you present it in that way. You give it that element of the real and just outside. And these are those little pieces that extrapolate into the void that create something huge. And also, by the way, the fact that King in Yellow is in Signalis, that just shot up my backlog list. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's funny, too, because I remember folks talking about it when the game came out. And, like, I sort of knew the reference, but mostly it was over my head. And so it was fun to then realize, oh, Power Pack is the name of the YouTube creator. I knew it would come back to me eventually. But, like, the fact that it's featured in there, the cover of the book, and there's then discussion of it. And I mean, Signalis also is a game that it's PlayStation 1 style graphics, vibes like a old school Silent Hill game, creepy plotting with an unclear narrative as well that warrants discussion. I think that the reason these kinds of games ultimately are fun and the stories around them is because they breed discussion. And if it's not clear already, Geoff and I like to talk about video games. And I think of when Ben Drowned first came out and folks were like, oh, is this a real game? Was there a cartridge? You know, before creepypastas had such great online writing and like cataloging.
Yes.
You know, I think of the SCP Foundation too, right? Like a lot of that also, which then games have come out that use stuff from the SCP Foundation to put in their games to add to that kind of horror element. It feels more communal. I think stories like this feel more communal, and why I think a lot of indie games are drawn to it and indie creators are drawn to it, because it just feels more communal. It's easier to have hearsay and unknowns about a indie title than about a AAA title where all is revealed. Like Alan Wake 2 had a ton of surprises, very scary game, but like I had an idea of what I was getting into, and there were still surprises, of course, because of how familiar I am with Remedy and the kinds of things they do in games. But when something like Inscription first comes out, if you don't know who Daniel Mullen is, which a lot of folks knew who he was before Inscription, now a lot more folks do after.
Right. Inscription was actually my first Daniel Mullins game. I knew of the Hex and Pony Island and was intrigued by them, but never got around to it. And then Inscription was my first step into it. So I'm very much an example. I had an idea of what was going on. I did not know the specifics.
Yeah, it's in the same way that we've talked about in the past about Animal Well being a really fun game to play when it came out because there was conversation around it and you get wrapped up in it. Inscription pretty much is known to be some kind of meta-narrative. Now, there are probably still folks in the dark, but it's a popular thing to know about it. Whereas when it first came out, it was just like, it's the new Daniel Mullins game. Pony Island had some cryptic shit in it, so this is probably going to have some cryptic shit in it. But because it broke through that barrier, like Balatro did, where it became a topic of conversation on a ton of top 10 lists, it became a known that's still fun to discuss, but I think kind of loses a little of this sheen when everyone knows about it because there's less mystery. It still can be mysterious, and it is still a fantastic game, and if you've not played Inscription, please go play it. But I think that the more that's obfuscated with these kinds of games, the more fun they are to discuss, and the more interesting they are to interact with.
And I think the ways that they do succeed, in particular for gaming, is the ways that they can be insidious. Where there's more than a few of these games that when we read or watch or hear a creepy telling of it, we read the story, we watch the YouTube channel, whatever it is, that is the narrative being followed and seeing and then there was a spread I'd never seen before. I've never seen this file before. What the hell is this? Or any of those. And then there are games that play with that. On the more benign level, a non-horror, the game One Shot does things that you play it on your PC, and then there are files that show up where they try to reach you, the player. And then there are those games like Doki Doki Literature Club.
Of course, yeah, I
and
was just going to bring that up.
I mean, that's an easy intro on that kind of thing. I'm Scared does that, to mention that one again. Those ones where even if you know what's happening, you know what's going to happen. The loss of agency hits you just a little bit. You know that it's going to happen. You know the 3D movie isn't going to touch you and they're just reaching a little outside of the screen. But it's just enough that even when you know it's coming, I think it gives a little bit of a thrill, whether you go in blind or not. And I think that is a fun mechanism of this meta that gaming in particular has. I have yet to play the console version of Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. I want to. I need to get around to that because I want to see how that plays out. I want to see what the virtual machine idea is, which is what I presume it's going to be, and if it hits the same way.
I mean, I do know what the twist is for that as far as how they do it, but I'll let you discover it on your own. But
Cool.
They set it up in a way that you can still play with the files and do all the meta stuff that you're supposed to. But like,
Nice.
yeah, I think also meta-narrative stuff, especially horror-bent meta-narrative stuff, feels impossible. And why it's so interesting. I think of one of my favorite scenes from Arkham Asylum when you slowly get gassed by Scarecrow, but you don't realize it. But as you explore through Arkham, Batman starts to cough more and cough more until eventually, I don't remember the inciting incident, but he blacks out and you wake up and it's the opening scene from the game, except now Joker's driving a tied up Batman to Arkham. And then you're in the strapped device that Joker was in as he's wheeling you into containment and like you're freaking out and struggling. It's done so well because the way it happens is the game glitches and freezes, and then it's a bat signal on the moon, but upside down to look like Joker's smile. And you're left to just sit there and go, wait, what the hell is happening? Like, it's very confusing and jarring, and it adds to the panic of this moment of like, what the hell is happening? And I love those kinds of moments in games because I never see them coming. I know some people can kind of have an idea of storytelling tropes, but for me, anytime a game does something like that where it pulls you out of it, I think of a late moment in Control that I won't spoil, but that is completely the antithesis to everything you've been doing in Control. And it's just a fun moment. It involves the game's end credits and stuff. And it's like, I just like when games break out of their structure. And I think a lot of the best creepypasta related stuff does that. It breaks out of its structure in a way or uses the game's structure itself to tell the story, not just what the content you're playing in the game, the narrative you're playing in the game.
Because they're trying to affect you, the player, as much as they're trying to affect the player character. In a non-haunted game meta way, but another example similar to Arkham is Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem for the GameCube.
Absolutely.
That has sanity effects, hallucinations that affect the player character mostly, and ones that affect you, the player, mostly. Ones that are the volume going down on your TV, your save files being deleted. You know they're happening, but oh my god, I still panic just a little bit every time when I play those because these are deeply ingrained in us. Your save files being deleted is not a fight or flight primal you're being chased by a predator kind of thing. This is a modern problem. However, it's one that we've learned, and it is a loss of something, and it is the loss of agency and control in the loss of it. And when you play games long enough, I've been playing video games since the NES era, and I know not to turn the game off while it's saving, I know to hold the reset button, etc., so it is such a terror moment. In a more haunted game setting, to what you were talking about, Matt, about structure. Yeah, video games do not have to follow the structures you think necessarily. Every time you start a game, we are learning how the game is structured. We learn its layout. We learn how they set their rooms and hallways. We learn if it's an open world or stages. We learn if it is real-time or turn-based. We learn 2D, 3D, all these facets and pieces. I could sit here for the next 15 minutes and try to think of whatever, but you get it. And so something is set up and you fill in the blanks and they go, we never said that. Or they've established a pattern and then the pattern is broken. I mean, this is how we get those sort of twists and moments anyway. We know what glitching looks like in a game, approximately. So when the game restarts and the Joker is taking Batman to Arkham, we have broken containment. But indie horror games and these meta horrors, sometimes there is homage being paid to this other game. It's like, oh, well, it's just going to be like that. We never said that. Or just a simple matter of it is what it is. If you have it looks like, an amateur made this. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. This kind of gets to a piece that is, I think, specific to gaming. Abandonware. That idea of, this was a game that they didn't finish. The idea of the story that drove the writer mad. The game that the devs just disappeared one day. Or they gave it up and refused to talk about it. Well, that's a convenient way to not have to interview anybody or prove veracity. But also, Matt, you and I as gaming podcasters and people in the world as gamers and journalists and everything else, we want to know what could have been. We played the demos. We are constantly on what this is, what that is. A couple years ago when there was the Space World demo of Pokemon Gold and Silver that was leaked, everyone loved that. You got to see a ton of sprites that never made it to the final game. You got to see all of these possibilities. The editing process of a video game is fascinating to me. You can make a minimum viable product. You can make something that works, and then you tweak it, take it away, add it. Oh, that character was in the fighting game, but they just took it out for some reason. All of these things have possibility and could be real. And we have been playing games long enough. We, the world, humanity, have been playing video games for long enough, for enough decades, that there's a lot of possibilities for debris. And there again, that PS1, N64 early polygon look of this looks like a beta. Even a beta for a later game, but this is just as far as they got. Or a lot of online games, a lot of PC games that never had physical releases that are digital only. Well, I think a lot of us have games from our childhood that we played on our computer that it's like, did that game really exist? Or can I go back and play that game? I don't know. I played Solarian 2, shoot 'em up, all the time when I was a kid. I think that's one that you can actually go back and play. There's enough, people saved it, but not all games. There's aspects and areas of the digital culture that's gone, or that is very hard to find or get working again. And that's being played with too. Matt, we played oneway.exe at PAX West this past year.
Yeah.
And that game very much is playing with this, and I'm very much looking forward to when it comes out, because it does have that idea of how I remembered online culture and online spaces and gaming of the time from a while ago. Well, there's 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. It all kind of comes together. And all of those, but what if it did this weird thing? And especially with computers, because there again, there is no easy way to see the walls and the edges. So you think you found the borders, and that was just the first stage of it. And those are porous, and there's more, or there's something worse. The ways that, I don't know if you ever sent or got sent screamer videos from friends. I certainly did. You see a nice little pastoral thing, and then suddenly a horrifying image and a loud noise gets you. When you play these games, is that what's waiting? And this is why, jump scares in modern indie horrors, there again, you don't know if it's a 5-minute game or if it's a 5-hour game. You don't know if it's the little things that are going to jump out at you or not. But it could.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these are based on the fear of the unknown, and jump scares cut to the core of that, right? It's why a lot of folks consider them cheap scares. I think they can be utilized well, but if a game is constantly jump scaring you, eventually it wears off. It's why you have to pick and choose your moments. And I think it's why some of the best creepypastas and some of the best games that use those kinds of narratives are strategic about it. I mean, based on what I've seen of the later Five Nights at Freddy's games, again, games that I've not really played a lot of, but have watched other people play, there's less jump scares and more creepy moments and more atmosphere. Like, there are still jump scares, but they're not the focus like they were in the first game. Now, to be fair, I played a lot of the first game. I tried to finish it. I couldn't. Too scary. But, there's a creepy ambiance, and then there's jump scares as well. And so I think you have to bring people in, and there's something believable about fear, because we're all afraid of something, right? Depending on what it is. We all have fears, and different horror taps into that. And I think video game horror specifically, again, it's a mix of what we've been already talking about, this not expecting what is going to happen, and then also digging into the things that people can be afraid of. Oneway.exe I think is really interesting also because it also has that meta layer of it's a haunted game that you found and you're trying to help solve what happened to these developers.
Right.
It's not that you're just playing a game and that it's creepy and that you can push outside the walls, but it's that meta narrative of something happened to the devs is included in it. And I love that too. And I think it's the strength of games like it and Doki Doki Literature Club and even the video series like Petscop and everything. I think of Poppy Playtime, which is a newer horror series where you are returning to a factory where haunted toys and monsters exist and trying to get to the bottom of why they exist, what happened there. Again, it's these real life scenarios of a toy shop with a CEO who wanted to just protect the children and brought in, created an orphanage on premises to help these children, blah, blah, blah. But then there's this meta narrative that really kind of adds to it. Or you think about something like Garden of Banban, which is both lauded and laughed at for a lot of similar reasons. It's also got a story of a teacher or a parent returning to the scene of a crime where children were lost and there's these larger-than-life creatures wandering. But it is goofier because they really play into the fanciful narrative of it in a way that's not about ambiance or mystery. It's kind of about, let's see what wild stuff we can do and put the character through and the narrative through. And I love that too. I think there's this ability to bring people in when you bring in things that, again, I think are grounded more in realism that then obviously couldn't actually be real. It's, I think, what made the older horror movies scariest too, right? The idea that someone would go around a summer camp killing everybody and is this kind of immortal being that then ends up to not is immortal being, isn't. Was it his mom? It was his mom, then it's him, whatever.
Now he's in space.
But like it was born of something pretty straightforward. I think of the leap from Evil Dead to Evil Dead 2. Evil Dead is basically a pretty straightforward horror story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little goofy in its presentation, but it is not meant to be funny or weird in the way that 2 and Army of Darkness are. Like there's a lot of inherent comedy in horror. It's why I love a lot of Jordan Peele's more recent horror stuff too, because you're as likely to laugh as you are to freak the hell out. I think that it all comes from this pushing on the boundaries of reality can both be funny and absolutely terrifying at the same time.
Because they're both a release of tension.
Right.
I've experienced as an audience member and as a performer many times in like intimate theatrical settings. When big moments happen, sometimes people will laugh at very inappropriate times. Not a big like roar throughout everything else, but just something escapes. Something has to get out. The tension is being wound up and something must be released. There does come a point where a horrible situation almost comes out the other side. We have a certain amount of suspended belief where we're like, okay, no, I'm here for what's going on right now in this world. Like, is that possible? Is there this strange thing from the dead? All right, cool. Them's the rules. I'm going with that. And then it can come out the other side as Looney Tunes, as this is just ridiculous. How many things can happen? Again, Jason X in space. How many times can you do that? And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But with indie game design, you can't go as big and bloated as a AAA game does. And sometimes you can go bigger and crazier than you realize, and that works. Sometimes it doesn't. That's why it's scattershot. But because choices must be made, you end up with, it's more akin to that campfire story, the tale being passed back and forth. This isn't the big budget movie. This is Evil Dead 1. This is a bunch of friends renting a cabin for however long their budget can allow and doing the best they can with what they learned in film school.
And I think a great example of like the release and the narrative, the storytelling campfire stuff is Slay the Princess, right? A game that I got into because I thought it was just a cool fantasy story. What if the narrator's unreliable? What if you had to kill a princess and you didn't know why? But that game can, depending on your choices, become absolutely a horror game and a terrifying one at that. But it is just as likely to make you laugh at something kind of ridiculous or be intrigued by something that's just kind of other or different. I don't mind clear genres. I like clear genres, but I think knowing less about what I'm getting into, like I knew I had to play mouthwashing. I barely knew why. And having played it that way, this goes back to our episode about how much of a narrative you give away. I still believe that the less I know about a game that's critically acclaimed, the better, because then I can make my own choices. It's why, though I've heard a lot about how great Detention is, I've still not dug deep because I want to play it for myself, you know? And I think that these kinds of games lend to that experience. There are tons of games that I think have really great narrative that, you know, it's what my whole thesis of side quests is based on, and how in the first episode I did on Control, which admittedly I haven't re-listened to in a while, I don't talk a ton about the narrative because the narrative is the best part of that game. I like the other stuff, the mechanics, the gameplay, whatever, but the story, especially if you're an X-Files fan, is weird as shit and really interesting. And I just don't want to give away those reveals. Then again, also Control even has a horror bent, and it is basically you're breaking into New York's version of the SCP Foundation because something took over the people there. And it can be very scary, though it is not marketed as a horror game. I think, again, it's just one of those things where, not to keep rambling about this, but in particular, I really like when things are obfuscated. And I personally then in those moments don't want to ask why it's obfuscated. I either want to go then watch a streamer play this thing or play it myself. And there are some of those games where even when the big mystery is revealed, it is still incredibly satisfying to play through those games. I had Undertale spoiled for me before I ever picked up a controller. I think I've talked about this before.
Yep.
And still that first moment where I accidentally killed Toriel, turned the game off immediately, went, shit, nope, got to start over, started over, and immediately Flowey called me on my bullshit. I went, excuse me? What the fuck is going on?
Possibilities.
Yeah, I never get tired of those moments, and it's why I think this topic was so exciting to talk about when we teased it a little bit last week, talking about the N64 and Shipwreck 64 and the like, and how that era of gaming, the PlayStation and N64 era of gaming, is where a lot of this started, because sprites never necessarily looked real for realism's sake, but we looked at sprites and went, we're not trying to be real. We are trying to make a thing. I feel like in the PlayStation and N64 era, it's the first time we were like, well, what if we tried to make it look real? And then the uncanny valleyness of what happens when you attempt that is why it's fertile ground for this kind of unnerving in-between. That awkward stage of design we were talking about.
Absolutely. I've watched game dev videos of all kinds of different kinds of indie titles. If a sprite is just a sprite, it's not a full animation or anything else, and you're just kind of moving it around, it looks a little silly, but it's very much almost like you've got a flat picture on a pencil and you're moving it in a puppet show. When you've got a character that's T-posed or whatever it is as the basic 3D model, yeah, that is still kind of moving an action figure around, but it hits the uncanny valley a little harder. I have not fully plumbed the depths of Haunted PS1 on itch, which, for folks who are not familiar with that, the Haunted PS1 is sort of a collection, channel, community, however you want to put it, that does horror game jam style stuff, very much in the idea of, it looks like it could have been on the PS1, playing into that design idea, and they will do haunted demo discs that are collections of small possibilities, as it were. And so there again, games that can come out now, people can release a game that is unfinished and go, well, what do you think about it? I'm still working on it, but drumming up interest. As an indie developer, that is something that needs to be considered. If I don't have a big marketing budget, how can I get people interested? Well, put bits and pieces of it out, generate word of mouth. What if that was the entire game? We don't know the borders, the depths, the structure, because we answer it every single time. And if you can't physically see the thing, you can't know. And so these kinds of stories, I hope they keep happening, and I hope we keep finding new ways to get weird with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think also in wrapping up, it preys a lot also on unknowns of technology, right? The average person doesn't know how a computer intricately works. You know, you turn it on, you know broadly how it works, but maybe not the intricate interactions between the pieces. Same with cell phones and other things. Like, you know that it works, you know the broad strokes, but you don't know the intricacies. It reminds me of the Simulacra series, which you can play on phone or on computer. Each game is about finding someone's phone after they died or whatever, and like the ghost in the machine almost. If you want to hear a retrospective on the Simulacra games, Jala Prendes over on Jalachan's Place covered the whole run. I think I've only like dabbled in the first game. It was a great conversation about these kinds of horror stories. again, it's not just that there was uncanny valley to this tech. It's also preying on folks not knowing a lot about tech. Now, if it's using technical jargon that is absurd and you are technically savvy, that could pull you out of it. I would say for the general public who doesn't always know about that kind of stuff, you can really lean in. And I really do hope that we can continue to get games that not only take advantage of a genre style or a design style, but making us question the devices themselves. I mean, to be fair, there's a lot to question already just in this real reality we live in. But I like those kinds of haunted horror stories, this kind of ghost in the machine, something was left behind with the thing you find. And what kind of stories does it have to tell you?
Yeah, I think that's it too, the kind of stories we can tell. Because sometimes it can be a very direct narrative, sometimes it is the mystery to be solved, sometimes it simply is. And that could be the scariest or the most fun of all.
Yeah.
Now we put it to you, listener. Have you played any haunted games? Do you know of any? Are you okay? Please send out a message. We need to be able to find you. Your signal's fading so much. But are there other meta-narrative experiences like this that you really enjoy? What are some that you wish more people played? You don't have to tell everybody about it, but at least give the title, because that's how we find these things. Please reach out, get in touch with us. There's so many great ways to find us. We are Fun and Games Pod across all social media that we are currently active on, which as of this episode is Blue Sky, Instagram, and Tumblr. We are funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, and who you'd like us to talk with on future episodes. If you've got something that just absolutely looks like a haunted video game, like it is just your copy of Metroid on the NES, but it just looks messed up, send us pictures. I think those are fun. You can visit certainpov.com and find not only other fantastic Certain POV podcasts, but a permanent invite link to our Discord server where a lot of these conversations continue and a lot of these topics are generated. If you enjoy what we do and you have the means and want to support us, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. There is a free tier, so you don't have to donate any money to be a part of that community, to be able to participate in polls when we do console retrospectives, and have a one-stop shop of all the things that Matt and I are working on. And we do want to shout out those on the high scoreboard. Today, the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Nyden, Alejandro Alves, Chris Copeline, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support and everyone's support. There's no need to enter your initials. If you check the camera roll on your phone, I think you'll see they're already entered.
Of course, a free way you can help us as well is to rate and review us on your podcast platform of choice, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Good Pods, Pocket Casts, basically anything that allows a rating or review. Only takes a few minutes. On Spotify, you can actually just skip ahead 30 seconds using the skip ahead button, and it counts as listening to the pod to then go rate and review if you happen to listen elsewhere. We really appreciate it. Again, while we love folks who throw money at us to allow us to grow and do the things we do, building the audience starts with those ratings and reviews and people being able to search to find us. So we really appreciate that quite a bit. Also, there's nowhere else to put this, so I'm just going to say it here. Home Safety Hotline was a game I've been hearing about since last year. That is literally this. You are staring at a screen and people are calling in to tell you about the cryptid they found and you have to advise them how to get rid of it. And I really want to play it because it just sounds ridiculous. But yeah, please rate, review, all of that stuff. Really helpful. If there are guests that you would love us to have on the show, if there are other podcasts you think we should check out and collaborate with, please let us know as well. As Geoff said, there are a bunch of ways that you can do that.
Yeah. Whether you let us know someone that should be on the show, whether you reach out on social media about some of your favorite found footage horror games, whether you are on the Patreon or this is your first episode of Fun and Games. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you so much. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Maddie K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too. Until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
And Jacob McCoy.
with many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.